In today's video, I'm going to talk about how I have begun incorporating the Charlotte Mason method into our homeschool, and particularly we are a classical homeschool. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, follow along. When I first heard about Charlotte Mason and her method of education, I really thought that Charlotte Mason was an easy, a gentle approach, a natural way of teaching, allowing children to be self-taught and self-led, child-led learning. And it didn't seem like it was very rigorous. And so I just kind of let it be and didn't look further into it. I decided to choose the classical model of homeschooling, which is the opposite end, or the opposite end in my opinion at that time, that it was very rigorous and would offer my children the best education. And I haven't changed my mind in that opinion, but what I have begun to realize is that Charlotte Mason is a classical model of homeschooling with a twist. And I really started to fall in love with a lot of Charlotte Mason's methods and approaches that I began to want to incorporate that into my homeschool. Now, I got a great question from a viewer last week asking, how do I apply Charlotte Mason to our classical homeschool? Because they also have a classical approach and want to apply some of Charlotte's methods. And so I've decided to share this video along with that I am reading a philosophy of education by Charlotte Mason, and I want to begin sharing my thoughts on it and how it's affecting the way I'm thinking as a homeschool teacher and what I'd like to do, how I plan to apply those changes that I'm really feeling are true and worth making into our homeschool. So for starters, one of the first things I incorporated into our homeschool this past year, we began in the summertime, was nature study and nature journaling. This is really something that Charlotte Mason has brought up in her writing over 100 years ago. And there are other curriculums that aren't necessarily Charlotte Mason method that follow this approach, but it really was Charlotte Mason who first began writing about this. Now, in the Charlotte Mason method, she states that nature study is all that the younger years need for science. That you don't need to actually begin a science curriculum per se, but you really just need to go out into nature and allow your children to make observations and dig deeper into those observations. That you're really learning to open your eyes to the world around us from the tiniest molecule, well, you can't really see molecule with your eyes, but to the tiniest specimen to the largest, all the way to the universe and to space. And I really was enjoying the things that I was learning about how to do nature study and how to do nature journaling. And so that was the first thing that I included. At first, I planned to also do a science curriculum beginning in September, but as we began our nature journey, our nature study journey and journaling, I decided to let the science curriculum go. My children are in grades 4, and a 5-year-old who is in, I guess, SK here in Canada. And so they don't need a rigorous science curriculum at this point. And so if it's unnecessary, or we don't have to really grab onto that and start that memorization and all of those things, then I was happy to leave it out. I was happy to have the peace of mind to know that someone who has been tried and tested like Charlotte Mason is saying that that's all that they need in the early years. I was happy to let go of the science curriculum and just do nature study. The other thing that I began to pay more attention to is narration. Now, in the classical model, particularly the well-trained mind, they do utilize narration. However, it's done a little bit differently than the Charlotte Mason's approach. And so I began to kind of look a little bit more closely at Charlotte Mason's approach and also using narration more often with all of our lessons. So that is with oral and written narration, we began to kind of look at more, utilize more on a day-to-day basis. And we began doing that this past summer as well. Now, there have been some changes to narration because I began to read A Philosophy of Education by Charlotte Mason, and I realized that there were some methods that I was using that were not fitting with her philosophy. And so I wanted to kind compare and contrast the classical model with Charlotte Mason. Now, Charlotte Mason is a classical approach to homeschooling. She is applying the classical model, but she has created her own twist that I believe does make sense. And after using the classical model of education for the past 4.5, nearly 5 years, I actually have begun to open my eyes to see the benefits of Charlotte Mason's approach to classical homeschooling. So there are really only slight differences between the classical model of homeschooling and Charlotte Mason's philosophy. And I've come to believe, and this might be my opinion, but I've come to believe that that difference is there primarily because, without knowing it, a lot of classical homeschool teachers and philosophers are incorporating a traditional model of homeschooling underlaying the classical model. And Charlotte has taken a painstaking effort in trying to remove this traditional approach from her thinking and from her philosophy. And I believe that is what a lot of that difference is. So I wanted to compare and contrast the classical model of homeschooling with Charlotte Mason's approach. And I'm not planning on talking, at length at all the points possible of how they differ, or how they're the same, but just the main important ones related to a philosophy of education and the things that I've been learning at the moment and how I'm planning on changing my homeschool. Now, I may continue in other videos to show how they continue to contrast or are alike, but in this video, I'm just going to be focusing on certain aspects. So first of all, and this is something that I've talked about in several videos, so I don't want to go at great length, but the classical model of homeschooling bases their approach on what they call the trivium. And the trivium is how they break down the stages of a learning by age ranges. So the first stage is called the grammar stage, and that is grades 1 to 4. And that stage is where they break down learning into bite-sized pieces of information. It is broken down into parts. For example, writing. A child is expected to not really understand how to convey ideas into words. And so rather than allowing them just to come up with their own ideas, we are giving them ideas by reading passages from books, getting them to do copywriting, where they will write out copies of passages, and then dictation, where you will dictate passages for them to write out. But they're not really able to say, you're not really saying, okay, here's a passage, what do you think on this? You're not getting them to come up with their own ideas in the grammar stage. It's filling them up with lots and lots of knowledge so that when they get to the next stage is known as the logic stage, which is grades 5 to 8. They are then able to go back over the information that they learned through the grammar stage and dig a little deeper and begin to understand the whys, the reasons, the logic behind what they have learned. And then they can begin to start to write, summarizing passages and things like that on their own. The next stage after that is the rhetoric stage, and that is grades 9 to grade 12. And that's where they're then going to go back over what they have learned through the grammar stage, the logic stage, and they are then able to learn how to come up with their own arguments, supporting their own reasons and rationale for their own thoughts in their writing and in their public speaking. So that is how the classical model generally breaks down each stage of learning. Now, Charlotte Mason doesn't break anything down in that way. She focuses on the whole person. A child is a whole person, and a child is born equipped with a mind that is able to absorb ideas and relate to those ideas in their own way at each age as they progress through their educational life. Now, why I thought Charlotte Mason was a gentle approach is because she's more actually an incremental approach. You begin with the early years offering only a little bit, only expecting a little bit, and then gradually you're adding more and more and more to that. Not so much in what you are teaching as opposed to the time that you're exposing them. So it's not that you're only giving them a bit and say, okay, that's it for you. You're giving them the full feast, but maybe only for 10 minutes. You're giving them the entire literature and beauty and everything, exposure to everything, but for incremental periods of time, and expecting more gradually over periods of time. So there's a difference in what you are giving to your child to look at, to read, to learn, to know, as opposed to in the classical model, you're only giving them what you believe they are able to take in, whereas Charlotte Mason is saying, give it all to them and they'll take from it what they should take for that age range. So both the classical model of homeschooling and Charlotte Mason do read a lot of literature. It's a literature-based type of learning, and where Charlotte Mason looks at living books, and a lot of classical curriculums now are also calling them living books as well, although they tend to be more classical pieces of literature. The classical, which is not classic. Classic books are older books that have reached a certain stage where they can be considered classics. Classical are the ancient forms of writing, philosophers, and thought based in that type of writing, or those actual ancient writings. Now, the classical model of homeschooling as well doesn't focus, at least the curriculum in the early years, doesn't focus on giving them the entire book. You're taking excerpts and passages out of it, the best parts of them maybe, or at least to the opinion of the curriculum writer, and reading those passages to them. Whereas Charlotte Mason is giving whole entire books to the child, reading the entire book and taking your time through that entire book, as long as it takes to really observe everything in that book that the child can take in. But living books, according to Charlotte Mason, are not just the classical, and they're not just classic. Now, many of them are classical and classic, but she also is interested in books written by people who have an experience or an expertise in particular topics. We are not to read textbooks or encyclopedias or someone just regurgitating information because they are good at researching and can look them up, but from the people who have lived experiences in those areas of life or topics or subjects. And that is what the meat and potatoes are in a Charlotte Mason book literature list. Now, I would say both the classical home educator and the Charlotte Mason home educator both act as facilitators rather than teachers. We aren't teaching the student as much as guiding them to help them become self-educators, and that is a focus in both Charlotte Mason and the classical model. I find the classical model does take a bit more of a hands-on approach where you are selecting what and how the child is fed, and Charlotte Mason is more like, here child, feast on this, and then you tell me back what it is that you've liked from this feast that I've given to you. So it's curated, but less, I don't know, for a lack of a better word, it's more natural. The student is naturally gravitating to the ideas and knowledge that you're laying before them, as opposed to telling them these are the ideas that you should be getting from these pieces of literature. Now, one big thing that I have found that is different between the classical model and Charlotte Mason, which is something that I am making changes now currently in our homeschool, is that in the classical model, as a classical homeschool educator, you are asking your children good questions to facilitate a discussion. You're guiding them with these excellent questions. So you really need to know and understand the material beforehand so that you can go and ask these wonderful questions that will lead them into discussions to help them think further into the literature. Whereas Charlotte Mason is saying, don't ask questions, don't amplify, don't explain, don't feed any information ahead of time. Allow the child to feast on the literature, and then afterwards, wait for their questions, wait for the discussion. Now, after they've read it, if you feel that there needs to be further explanation, you can lead them into some discussion and questions to break down what they have already gotten out of the works, out of the literature. But when you are questioning them ahead of time, it's almost as though you are guiding them, their ideas. You're guiding the shape of what they will draw out of the piece, which we might say, well, that's not a bad thing. I want them to vote, but we are taking away from, and I'm going to read a quote to you in a bit, so that'll better explain. In fact, I'll cut myself off there because Charlotte says it better herself. So now I just want to quickly do a quick review, not a review. I want to share with you what I am learning from A Philosophy of Education by Charlotte Mason. Now, I'm only going to break it down into the first few chapters because there is a lot of information to take away. And so I don't want to overwhelm you. And I'm just, from these first few chapters, I am pulling bits and pieces out of it and applying it to our homeschool. And so I'm going to stick to the first few chapters, and in a future video, I will go over chapter by chapter, the rest of the book, what I'm pulling out of it. And I may read my notes here to kind of help me along, because of course these are Charlotte's words and not mine. So in the introduction, there's an introduction, which is really its own chapter in itself. And then chapter 1 and chapter 2 is what I'm going to be covering today. So in the introduction, one of the major points that she discusses here is how a utilitarian perspective has made its way into education throughout history. In society and the educational system, utilitarian perspective has sort of taken over. And by that I mean that what is necessary, what it takes to get from point A to point B, is all that is taught to our children. They're not given the full feast of everything that they might possibly be interested in. But if they say, well, I want to get to this vocation or this goal in life, I need to learn A, B, C, and D. That's it. That's all I need. That's the point of education. And this utilitarian approach takes away the joy of learning and learning for the sake of learning, and doesn't turn people into lifelong learners. And B, the goal of learning is the vocation or the goal. The goal of learning should be the love of learning. And that doesn't happen when we take this utilitarian approach. And systems like grades, rewards, prizes, praise for achieving, a certain amount of education is often what motivates us and children to learn, as opposed to just wanting to learn about something. She also says this in the introduction: the more of a person we succeed in making a child, the better will he both fulfill his own life and serve society. Charlotte focuses and is interested in the whole person, mind, body, and soul. She tells us that children, not teachers, are responsible for their own educations. And our goal as a teacher is to help our students become self-sufficient in obtaining their own knowledge. They are self-educating. She says, the mind of a child takes and rejects according to its needs. So we aren't necessarily needing to decide what the child needs to take away from our read alouds and from what we are presenting to them. They will take and reject from it what they need. For example, I'm reading this book and I'm taking away a lot from it, and I think these are all great things, but you might read this book and take away something completely different from me. And that is how she is saying our minds are designed. She also says the desire of knowledge or curiosity is the chief instrument of education. That instrument can be paralyzed or made powerless like an unused limb when we rely on other motivation for education, such as rewards and prizes and ambition and even praise. And then she also says that if it is desirable to ask questions, to emphasize certain points, these should be asked after and not before or during the act of narration. This allows the child to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions. So in chapter 1 now, She says, the life of the mind is sustained upon ideas. The mind, like the body, digests its proper food, and it must have the labor of digestion, or it ceases to function. So essentially, she's saying the more food that you give to your child's mind, the better, the more it will grow and thrive. And this is done in whole books, and this is done in good books and great books. And this is the basis of Charlotte Mason's education. She also says that if a passage be read more than once, he may become letter perfect, but the spirit, the individuality, has gone out of the exercise. And I have been guilty of this, where I feel like you didn't get it this time. I'm going to read it again. Okay, you haven't gotten the point, or the point that I think is the point, and I'm going to keep rereading these passages or this book or these chapters to you. She also says the teacher who allows his scholars the freedom of the city of books is at liberty to be their guide, philosopher, and friend, and is no longer the mere instrument of forcible feeding, which is what I was feeling I was becoming. I was forcing my children to learn. You've got to learn this stuff. It's important. If you don't learn this stuff, you're not going to get to university. You're not going to get a great career. You're not going to achieve your goals. And that isn't the way to make them passionate about learning. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points from chapter 2. She says, he always has all the mind he requires for his occasions. That is, that his mind is the instrument for his education, and that his education does not produce his mind. We aren't producing minds for our children by educating them. They already have a mind, and their mind is the instrument for education. And finally, she also says, this is how a child's mind works, and our concern is not to starve these fertile intelligences. They must have food in great abundance and variety. So from these first 3 chapters, these are the things that I am doing to make changes to our homeschool. Now, first of all, the classical model of homeschool is a Charlotte Mason approach, and so you really can use classical curriculum if that's what you have, or the curriculum that you already have, and apply these principles. But I have found after reading these things and looking through the curriculum that we have that there are some of them that don't quite facilitate what I would like to do. So I'm still using them this year. Next year, I may drop a thing or two and I will update you on that. And I may try I may not even be using curriculum per se at all, but we will see and we'll get to that. But you can apply Charlotte's philosophies and these methods in the curriculum that you already have. And so this is what I will be doing for starters. So I am starting out by just simply reading to my children. It's going to be a straight reading without adding. I often will pause and stop and explain if I feel like I look at their faces and they're not getting it, or I'll say, did you understand that? Well, this is what the author really meant. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to just do a straight reading of the passages or the books that we are doing, and that is it. Now that's not it, but then I'm going to allow them, without leading them, I'm going to allow them to then narrate back to me orally and or in writing what their takeaway is, what their summary of the passage might be, what stood out to them the most. And that is going to be the major meat and potatoes of how we are going to do history and science and Latin and really all the subjects. I'm blanking out on the names of the subjects right now, but that is how we're going to be doing them. After they narrate, I'm then going to guide them into discussion. So if there are some key points that I feel like they didn't hit on or they didn't understand, I'm then going to ask questions and guide them into a discussion. Maybe talk about some of the definitions of the words that they might not have gotten. Now, one approach actually, now that I'm saying this, is that you can have a list of words. As you're reading a read aloud, you may have a list of words and say, these are the words that are going to be in this passage. This is what the meanings of these words are. Keep your ear out for these words and see how they fit into it. and see, what you think of them. And you may use them in your narration as well, after kind of explaining a few things that you may go ahead of time and pre-read and see if there needs to be some pre-explanation, but not explaining the passage, just more defining some words in the passage. That I think is a good thing to do ahead of time. And then in the discussion, you're then discussing the meaning of the passage, what it means to them. And also if they had any questions or concerns over parts of the reading, that will be the time to have that further discussion after they've already had a chance to narrate or summarize back to you what we have read. Another thing that I find, what I've taken away from Charlotte Mason's book, is that other than reading and math, I'm going to stop focusing on perfection, of knowing all the facts, of getting them all straight and having all the right answers, and really allow myself to retrain my brain and theirs to just discover, to have a passion for ideas, and trace those rabbit trails of the ideas that they're passionate about, as opposed to saying that's not fully correct. As we go along, as they grow, they are going to get a deeper and deeper understanding of things. But at the younger years, in the grades 4 and kindergarten range, which is where we're at, I have been expecting perfection. I have been expecting them to know all the names and dates and definitions and things like that, which is really a classical approach. But this is a restful way of teaching, that also promotes a love of learning. And I'm seeing that as a possibility in our homeschool now. And it does become very rigorous. And so there doesn't have to be a fear of a lack of rigor, but you are now presenting them with a way to learn how to love ideas and literature and learning. One thing that I am going to do with our current curriculum is not that I'm going to necessarily stop using it. It's that sometimes it just needs a little tweaks. We might need to change the order or leave some things out in order to make it more Charlotte Mason. For example, we are doing Writing with Ease. And Writing with Ease, you read a passage from classical pieces of literature, and after that, you ask them questions that is basically guiding them through their narration. It's kind of saying, okay, well, these are the main points. What was this point? What was that point? Okay, now give me your narration. Well, it's kind of backwards. And I know that the classical model does want you to do a guided narration in the early years, but I think that takes away from the individuality of how they are taking in that piece of literature. One takeaway from this for me is that lessons will naturally become shorter, and that's a good thing for everyone. We can fit more in, we can cover more topics. I won't go over the details, but Charlotte Mason does have a breakdown of how much she expects for each grade, and you're really only incrementally adding a little bit of time more and more, where, for example, in high school, they might only spend 30 to 45 minutes on a specific topic. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but they are, if you hear the stats, if you know how these, and they become lifelong learners. They go off and get their graduate, and PhDs, and there's nothing holding them back from achieving all the goals, educational goals that they want in life, because they love to learn. But this happens really nicely in this incremental way, and I'm enjoying that lessons will naturally be shorter because of it. One kind of last point I wanted to make is that following any curriculum too rigidly, even if it's a Charlotte Mason curriculum, is not the Charlotte Mason approach. Charlotte Mason wants us to follow our children's lead, not in that they're like, oh, well, you don't feel like learning this today? Okay, forget about it. No, we're going to still introduce them to topics and subjects that they might not have interest in, but we don't have to follow the curriculum. So if there's fill in the blanks, work pages, for example, my daughter right now, we're doing dictation, but she's kind of moved on from dictation. She's not needing dictation in order to help her with her writing. She's really grasped writing narrations on her own without me doing the copy work and the dictation. She's advanced past that, and that's a classical model approach. So you can begin to leave out what's unnecessary. You can leave out the fluff. You can just do the readings, and it's very possible just to read great books in the early years, particularly, other than the reading and the math, and offer them a wonderful education. But following any curriculum too rigidly because you feel like you've got to do it all in order to get it done is really not a Charlotte Mason approach. And that's something to consider. It's okay to leave things out. It's okay to not fill in all the pages. There is so much more to say about this book. And I really only covered, I think, the major things that affected me the most in our homeschool. I really suggest that you read this book for any type of homeschooling philosophy that you might have, because there really are some beneficial points to take away from it. But I will be coming up with more videos in the future to talk about the book, each chapter, what I'm getting from it, and what I'm doing differently in our homeschool. So I hope you stick around to see those videos. If you're interested or have any other questions for me regarding what I've said today or what you'd like for me to talk about in future videos, please comment below, because I really love to hear from you. But that's all I have for you. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.